Okay, well, it's 3:05. It looks like we're still getting some people joining, but I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Since we only have an hour, there is a lot to discuss. Want to thank all of you for your time. I did share the poll results for our icebreaker. Um, you can see a lot of people when they were a kid like sharing homework and probably confusing their friends with bubble gums. And when I was reading that, I actually was thinking about like the jelly beans and totally took part in sharing the booger flavored jelly beans. Um, People obviously don't like cooking and cleaning, like sharing that. And teleportation seems like it was kind of a winner, and people would rather be a trillionaire now than travel into another time. Thanks for taking part of that while we were waiting. Again, we do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So good afternoon and welcome to the State of Oregon Research Academy's event, How to Communicate the Value of Data. There's a link to the handout in the chat that I shared. It's also available on our website at oregonresearch.org. You'll also find information on this event and events in the past, including videos and materials if you're interested. For those who do not know, the State of Oregon Research Academy, better known as SORA, is a no-fee volunteer organization made up of data-interested individuals and data professionals from across state government. With over 700 registered members across more than 20 state agencies, it is the largest organization of its kind in Oregon government. SORA provides opportunities to network, build connections, and learn more about research, data, and statistics. Over the past year, we have had some obvious setbacks in supporting those opportunities, and we do appreciate your understanding as we begin to revamp our offerings to a more digital platform for the time being. My name is Daniel McKay. I work at the Oregon Lottery, and I'll be your host this afternoon. I will be moderating the chat also. If you have any questions for the presenters, please feel free to send them my way, and I'll make sure that you're asked to the speakers at the end of their presentation. After written questions have been received and answered, I will open the floor to those who wish to ask questions themselves. As this is an open forum, I ask that each of you remain respectful and mute yourself when you're not speaking. So we do have a great set of presentations for you this afternoon. I'm very excited to hear from all of our presenters. This is also the first event of a series that SORA is going to be having on data literacy. So the speakers today will tell us how their data adds value to agency goals and missions, as well as provide some insights to help you communicate the value of data to others within your organization. So first up, we have Aaron Corbin and Tasha Chapman from the Department of Consumer and Business Services talking about how their data helps improve safety and health for Oregon, Oregon OSHA, and the COVID-19 pandemic. We will then pass things over to Hannah Osinga from SAFE and Alan Molina, sorry for the dog, from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will discuss how to communicate the value of data. So a little bit about our first two speakers. Aaron Corbin is the Public Information Officer for Oregon OSHA, a division of the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services. He has served in this role for more than 5 years. His responsibilities include speaking to media about the division's activities, developing strategic communications, serving on the division's core executive team, writing press releases, talking points, FAQs, and web and social media content, as well as editing the division's health and safety resource newsletter. He is a member of the DCVS communications team. Previously, he was also a print journalist for more than 20 years, working at daily and weekly newspapers and monthly magazine in Washington and Oregon. Our second speaker for our first presentation is Tasha Chapman. She's a research analyst in the Central Services Division at the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services, serving as lead analyst to support Oregon OSHA and the workers' compensation system. She has been an employee of the state of Oregon since 2005 and previously worked with the Oregon Health Authority and Oregon Department of Human Services. She received a master's degree from the University of California, Riverside in personality psychology research with an emphasis on personality assessment and psychometrics. Tasha Chapman also currently serves as SORA's communication coordinator. Thank you, and Aaron and Tasha, if you guys are ready, please begin your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Aaron and I are going to talk a little bit about kind of what Oregon OSHA's role has been during the COVID-19 pandemic, a little bit about the data that we've used in that, and the people who've been asking for that data, because there's been quite a few people who have been really interested in in what we're doing. So Aaron, I'm going to pass it over to you. You want to talk a little bit about kind of what OSHA's role has been with COVID-19?
Absolutely. So, as you know, the pandemic triggered just a public health crisis across the globe. And of course, that hit home here in Oregon. And I remember in probably around mid to late March is when things intensified for Oregon OSHA. So as you recall, the governor adopted emergency measures. These measures, of course, applied in a lot of different ways, a lot of corners of life across Oregon. For Oregon OSHA, the reason things intensified is that part of what the emergency measures affected was workplaces across Oregon. And I remember in, about around mid-March to late March, the governor was doing quite a bit of press. Obviously, media interest was high in the emergency orders, the effect those orders would have. The bottom line was, in an attempt to basically save people's lives, to try and get measures in place that would prevent the transmission of the coronavirus. And so when the governor was doing quite a bit of press, Oregon OSHA was certainly coordinating on that level with the governor's office. Obviously, it was an emergency situation, so there was quite a bit of scrambling going on. Ultimately, I recall talking to the governor's, some of the press staff at the governor's office, because she was literally headed into a press conference, and they were expecting a lot of questions. And one of the central questions, and it did come up, was how would the state enforce these emergency measures? And of course, there were other enforcement mechanisms when you're talking about non-workplace, that non-workplace context. But for Oregon OSHA, we basically ended up running point on workplaces. And so when the governor was asked and said that Oregon OSHA would obviously take the lead in enforcing these measures in the workplace, that really prompted what can only be described as arguably the most intense spotlight that's ever been put on Oregon OSHA, the media spotlight. And what happened was, Oregon OSHA, and I know Tasha will get into this later in the presentation, Oregon OSHA has long been set up to take complaints about workplace hazards. So we've long had a system to do that. But once it was announced that Oregon OSHA would be handling the enforcement, I would say media across the state, small newspapers, large newspapers, radio, TV news, you name it, basically splashed the Oregon OSHA online hazard reporting form all over the place. And so normally, Oregon OSHA, we're viewed as taking complaints from workers. We can take complaints from a number of different sources, but normally, we're taking them from workers who are unhappy with, what's going on at their work site. And so in this case, once the hazard reporting form was put out there, we were flooded with complaints, unprecedented levels of complaints. And so in March, in a 2-week period, there were probably, roughly, it was over 2,000 in a 2-week period. And just to give you a sense, in a typical year, a non-pandemic year for Oregon OSHA, we see just over 2,000 complaints. So from that point on, it was essentially what I would describe as a kind of fire hose of complaints. And so it was an all hands on deck project for Oregon OSHA. What we're talking about here are complaints about a lack of physical distancing, a lack of facial coverings, a lack of even teleworking. I mean, there were different components to the governor's emergency measures. And so there were a lot of complaints that, Oregon OSHA had never seen before. Our typical focus is on high hazard industries like agriculture, construction, manufacturing, logging. And so what this ended up having us do is making inquiries, investigative inquiries into office spaces, retail spaces. It's not that we never get to those places, but we were getting to them, or at least they were getting on our radar far more than they ever did. And so once this really kicked in, we basically, again, it was an all hands on deck project for the staff to essentially triage and absorb an unprecedented volume of complaints. Now, with all the media attention, as we were logging these complaints, as you all know, that amounts to data, and quite a bit of it. And so in my role, which bottom line is to tell the story of our agency, to maintain transparency. We're a public agency, obviously. So it was about, at that point, tracking the data. And after, the news got out, if you will, about Oregon OSHA's role, we pretty much had a regular attention from media. And that attention amounted to requests for data, and that ranged in a lot of different ways. The types of industries we were getting complaints about, the alleged hazards themselves. So multiple media outlets were interested in this information. And so really what the pandemic and again, the emergency measures did was put Oregon OSHA in a place where we frequently, often had to tell our story in the form of data. And, and working closely with Tasha, we developed talking points, messages, a number of different content pieces as needed. There was a lot of crisis communications, on the spot requests for data. So this had to be managed in a way where we could connect with the public through media and do it relatively quickly and relatively accurately with reams of data that we were basically collecting as this data was flowing in. So that's kind of what got us onto the path to all of this data that we still to this day get requests for, and that we continue to analyze, and we continue to tell that story about how we're enforcing on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of us who aren't familiar with Oregon OSHA, let me give you kind of a brief overview of what a typical year looks like for Oregon OSHA. So enforcement's not the only thing that OSHA does, but it is a big part of the agency's mission, right, to enforce health and safety within the workplace. And within a typical year, there are usually about 3,000 to 5,000 inspections that are done by Oregon OSHA compliance officers. And of those, about 25 to 35% are found to be in compliance, which is another way of saying that about 65 to 75% actually find a violation of some kind, or a hazard of some kind related to workplace safety. All of this information you can actually find on our DCBS website. The easiest way is to just go to oregon.gov/DCBS. Down as you scroll at the very bottom, there's a link for statistical reports. And this is these reports I'm showing right here are actually as part of our Oregon Workers' Compensation System report. So if you go to the safety and health section, it'll show you some of this information. Along those same lines, if we talk about, citations, violations, and penalties, again, as I mentioned, about 65 to 75% find some sort of a violation. So there's a citation that's issued. Some of those violations come from actually have a financial penalty involved, and some don't. Some are don't have that financial penalty. The ones that do, the penalty can sometimes be very small, in just a couple $100s, whereas others can be up into the thousands, tens of thousands. And that really kind of depends on the severity of the hazard that's found, the likelihood that somebody could be seriously injured or even die as a result of that particular hazard. So, OSHA's pretty busy every year trying to basically find these hazards and work with employers to correct them. Now, in the COVID year, obviously, things changed a little bit. The number of inspections we did was significantly less than in a typical year, but there's, of course, obviously a lot of different reasons for that. One of the things that our administrators mentioned is, like, there was an initial concern about making sure that we weren't actually even a carrier or a potential vector for creating new infections by sending our compliance officers out into these workplaces, right? But aside from that, finding more creative ways to work with employers, proportionally speaking, things have been fairly similar to what you see in a typical year. The big change, though, has to do with, as Erin was mentioning, what's been driving those inspections. So in a typical year, we usually use what's known as a randomized inspection scheduling list, which drives what's known as program planned inspections, which is a really fancy term. But basically, there's a list that's created of all the employers in the state of Oregon, and Oregon OSHA uses that list to determine who they're going to randomly inspect. That list is determined in large part based on the industry that an employer is in, because we target our inspections for employers that are in more hazardous industries, right? So we're more likely to go out and inspect a foundry than a sawmill than we are to inspect an insurance office. But again, COVID, for reasons that Erin mentioned, turned that completely on its head, right? Instead of doing these program plan inspections that we usually do, a lot of the inspections are complaint driven. Now, these are not the only reasons that we go out and do inspections, but they're two of the primary reasons, right? And so, and again, that has to do with that volume of complaints that Erin mentioned, right? So typically we get about 2,000 complaints a year, whereas this year, since COVID started, we're up to over 27, up to almost 28,000 complaints now that we've received. So again, many, many more complaints than typical. And of those, 23,000 were for COVID-related hazards. And so there's actually a fair amount that weren't even related to COVID too, that came in during that same period of time. As Erin mentioned, it's pretty easy to file a complaint. You can actually do it at the Oregon OSHA website. If you go to OSHA.org, which is the quick and easy address to get there, there's a link for file a complaint, and there's information that's gathered about the complaint. So usually it's pretty basic, who's the employer or the work site that you're complaining about, what are the hazards that you're seeing, and then a little bit about who you are, although complaints can be filed anonymously or confidentially as well. So depending on whether or not you want to provide your information about who you are, or you can provide it to Oregon OSHA, but ask that information be kept confidential. Aside from that, though, it's important to note that the complaint information itself is public record, as is information about our inspections and violations. Those are all public record. So this leads to a fair amount of data that's available now about who are these employers that are, getting complaints received about, what are some of the hazards that are being identified in some of these complaints. So we have, it's pretty large data set that we've been creating. Well, obviously we've had this data set already, but like an actual spreadsheet that we've been able to put together so we can send this out to people who've been asking for it. And then we also have information, again, easily packaged up and ready to go about the inspections and violations we've been doing related to COVID-19 specifically. So you can see information about who's been cited, what's been the cost of that citation, things of that nature. So Erin's been pretty instrumental in shipping that data out to people who request it. News media has been a pretty big consumer of some of that data. So Erin, you want to talk a little bit about how some of that data has been used?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. A couple things to note here. During this time, basically, not only has Oregon OSHA received data and public record inquiries from what I would describe as local or regional media here in Oregon, and that's across platforms. But we've also received inquiries from national media, and that includes the New York Times, the Washington Post, ProPublica, ProPublica in particular has actually been a fairly frequent data requester. So just a really a lot of attention and a lot of requests. So a couple things. If you look at the KEZI.com slide, for example, so I would describe there being different levels to what media are requesting, and for that matter, what media can do, or the type of media you're working with. So in that situation with KEZI, which is a TV news, that's an online post, of course, really all they were really going for there is to get a sense of how many complaints we had received in a particular period. And then they also wanted to get a sense of our process. So, and I should pause here because, Tasha was talking earlier about what Oregon OSHA does, what we're about. Because with all of the attention that came with the pandemic, a lot of what we did, in addition to taking these data requests, was also explaining to people about what we do and who we are. This brought a lot of attention to Oregon OSHA. It's not that people didn't generally have the sense, oh, OSHA, they're the workplace health and safety agency, but when you really start getting into something that's grabbing so much media attention, you get finer grained questions. People want to know, how does it work? What's your process like? And so with that particular story, for example, they wanted a sense of the data, how many complaints we had received in a particular period of time. And then they also were interested in our staff. What do we have? How do we go out and inspect these things? How are we handling the complaints? Roughly the same is true of the KGW slide, for example. So that was really what I would call almost a check-in story by that news outlet, basically asking us, or trying to give a sense of the scale, if you will, of what we were seeing in terms of complaints. And in that case, at that point, we had received something on the order of 15,000. And so really for TV media, for that vehicle for disseminating news, they were looking for what I would describe as sort of relatively on-the-spot stories, something to let their readers know, to update them kind of how we were doing, how Oregon OSHA was doing. And of course, there are different, levels that we talked about. So different levels of interest from media. I use this case with the Bulletin newspaper in Bend, which is also for a community paper, I would say, has been pretty savvy about its records requests, about its data requests. And I should pause here when we talk about data and records, and Tasha really did touch on this, which is there are times, and the Bulletin has done this, where they'll ask for the spreadsheet, and that'll give them kind of a sort of a face value of the data that they're dealing with. That'll give them the basic allegation, the location, the employer name. That alone is probably enough to write a story for their coverage area, because they can filter down to Deschutes County, for example, and tell a story about what's going on there. But when we're talking about data, we're also talking about the underlying public records. And so what you would also get is, once they would get the data, some reporters, including the Bulletin, would request the underlying records, the complaint records, how we resolved those records. If we launched an on-site inspection, for example, and that was resolved and we cited someone, we would then get requests for those paper records, if you will, to kind of contextualize the data that we were putting out there. In this particular case, this I would call the Bulletin story here, and basically an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to tell a kind of a story about Oregon OSHA and the fact that we're holding employers accountable. So the angle of this story, and you'll see this in the headline and the subhead, is essentially basically showing a description of employers who are having complaints filed against them. And they're describing those allegations. And I believe in this particular story, the reporter actually did reach out to a few of the employers that had complaints filed against them. And obviously this creates a certain amount of friction because under Oregon's, the way Oregon OSHA follows the Oregon Public Records Law, the allegation that comes with that complaint is releasable because it's a pre-investigative fact of the complaint. And I do recall, there was a couple of employers who had called our staff kind of complaining about, how is it that you can release this information? And, the answer is it's public record. And, what we would attempt to do in working with media, again, telling that story, we're a public agency, we're interfacing, the media, for good or for ill, are essentially a proxy for the public. And so, we're speaking to the public through media. And so I always try to contextualize these issues by explaining that, a part of what we were doing was trying to educate employers. It wasn't a matter of we get a complaint and we're going to rush out and inspect a place. And to some degree, that's not always a from a reporter standpoint, that's not necessarily a satisfactory answer, but we had to contextualize some of these stories because, our compliance officers, they're not, running around with ticket books. So there was a timing issue to this as well. Again, in this particular story with the Bulletin, it really was focused on getting employers' reactions to some of these allegations. And quite frankly, from Oregon OSHA standpoint, from a public affairs, public relations standpoint, that's a fine story to see. That's a fine headline to see. And one of the things that we were trying to put out there, because if you look at public relations as a component of a program, in this case, Oregon OSHA's enforcement program, it is what I would call kind of adding some leverage. And we actually do have a press release policy at Oregon OSHA, but if we can get the news out there that we are enforcing and that there is accountability, that actually adds to our enforcement program, that adds to the on-the-ground real instances where our folks are getting out there and inspecting work sites for COVID issues. These are the stories in these slides are examples of where you can really tell your story through media. I would hasten to add that, and as a former journalist, this is true, which is you should always be prepared for the story to be potentially negative. It's just that's inevitable. And of course, we've had tough stories done. There was a case where the Oregonian requested our data and did a pretty tough story on outbreaks at workplaces. And really the point there was what we did not want to get into a situation with, the situation of, was to tell them that we did not have the data, or we could not produce the data in a timely manner, because then potentially the story gets worse. Then it potentially spills into a situation of why don't you have the data? Or are you hiding something? And so even when the story is potentially negative, there's always the opportunity to influence it, to gain goodwill by engaging with media, by getting them the data in a timely manner, and then basically putting your best foot forward. And from our perspective, I've done quite a number of interviews. I'm always coordinating with our subject matter experts, with our administrator has given interviews as well. So Oregon OSHA, the track record has been that we engage, whether or not it's going to be positive, negative. We don't want someone telling the story without the opportunity to influence it. And we can certainly do that through the absolute fantastic work that folks like Tasha do in gathering and analyzing this data, and we can do that through engagement and transparency. And so that's kind of that's been kind of the road we've been traveling in terms of media and COVID data.
Fantastic. So I just wanted to leave you guys with our contact information. And say thank you for coming to this first event of 2021. And Daniel, do we have any questions or anything at this point?
I don't have any in chat that I couldn't answer myself. If anybody does have questions, please, feel free to send me a message, or at this point, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask those questions.
Absolutely.
To get started, just one of the things that I noted in your presentation, you mentioned there was something called proposed fines. Is that different than what you'd have as paid fines, or I guess what proportion of proposed fines are actually paid or levied?
So, well, the reason it says proposed fines is actually those are fines from the initial inspection. They could potentially be changed through the appeals process, but on our data reports, we usually put out the initial penalty as another term for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? I'm Tasha and Aaron, are you hanging around? I can also, I'll solicit questions. If you guys have anything, just send me in chat and I'll go ahead and make sure you get those answers.
Yeah, I'll absolutely be here.
Awesome. So, now we're moving on to the next presentation. We're going to have Hannah and Alan talk about how to communicate the value of data. Really quickly, Hannah's a strategic research analyst at SAFE, which is Oregon's not-for-profit workers' compensation insurance company. She likes to connect with people to understand their work and analytics needs. She strives to make data approachable and produce insights that are practical, actionable, and help guide a response to the questions she hears most often. So what do we do now? Hannah has spent 4 years at the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services doing analysis on workers' compensation and forecasting financial regulation data. In college, Hannah majored in business and economics. She then earned a graduate degree in economics with specialization in public economic policy from the University of Amsterdam. Hannah also currently serves as SORA's executive committee chair. Our second presenter for this presentation is Alan Molina, and he's a senior economist at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. His research interests include natural resource economics, specifically non-market valuation of natural resources. Alan oversees many projects in his role, including licensed revenue projections, fiscal impacts, price elasticity modeling, and human dimension surveys. Research integrity, reliability, and validity are core tenets of Alan's philosophy on data analysis, and he hopes to share his philosophy with other researchers in the state by being a member of SORA. He was born in San Francisco, California, and received his bachelor's degree in physics from San Francisco State University, and both his master's degrees in resource and applied economics, and his PhD in natural resources and sustainability from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Alan also currently serves as SORA's vice chair. So take it away, guys.
All right, thank you, Daniel. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about the value of data. And as a participant in this event, you likely see the value of data yourself. I think the challenge could be in communicating that value to others. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. That's what that handout that you may have received via email earlier today, that's what that's focused on. And if you didn't receive that handout, that PDF earlier today, I did notice that Daniel did pop it into the chat. In case you have any issues accessing it, please just type in the chat and Daniel can help you out there. So what we're going to do is Alan and I are going to spend a few minutes talking to you about what we're doing here and some tips for talking about communicating the value of data. And then we'd like to hear from you. We'd open it up to hearing about your tips for what works well for you communicating the value of data. What are some of your success stories of using data in projects, or what are some of the challenges you're facing and how can we talk through those together? But before we dive in, I'd like to remind you why we're doing that, why we're doing this. This is part of SORA's 2021 Data Literacy Program. If you attended either of our virtual events last December, the slide that you see on the screen right now, it may look familiar. What we did during those events is we introduced these 4 pillars of data literacy. That's data value, data access, data analysis, and data presentation. And at those events in December, we did define each of those pillars, and we got your feedback, you as SORA members, your feedback on each of these 4 pillars. You said that that all of these 4 pillars are interesting, and you'd like to learn more about each of those. And so what SORA has done, what the executive committee has done, has committed to bringing you one event about each of those pillars in 2021. And we're starting with data value today. And what this means is knowing the value of data, that data is available or that it could be collected, and appreciating the value it adds to projects. And again, I think that as participants in this event, you know that you're there, right? But Alan, can you share some stages that people and organizations might go through to get there?
Absolutely. And thanks for the intro. This is something that we found and thought was a really good representation of some of the ways that agencies and businesses and companies, and just in general, how they kind of move through or move towards this idea of data-driven culture and really have that be ingrained in them. This is particularly important, specifically because there's going to be a pop quiz on it. Not quite a pop quiz, there'll be a poll question. But we're going to be asking you a question related to this. So start thinking about kind of these stages and how they might relate to you. So the first stage is this data denial stage. So if an organization just absolutely distrusts the idea of using data, feels like it can be used just to manipulate, doesn't like the idea of using anything besides intuition to drive decision making, that's the stage they're in. Data denial, absolutely wants no part of data or anything that comes with it. Excuse me. The next step would be data indifference. So that's definitely not an active distrust. However, there's not real interest in moving the other way either. So there's no interest in collecting data, using data for decision making, not really seeing a lot of the value there in doing those things. Data aware would be the next one. So again, awareness is there. It might be on the periphery. The organization might be collecting some of this data, might even be kind of toying around with the idea of using it for decision-making processes. It might be a requirement for whatever their business is or for whatever their responsibilities are. They may need to be tracking certain things, and so okay, data exists, and they might be using it to some extent, but definitely not a part of their organization fundamentally. The next step would be data informed. So managers of this organization or members of the organization are really using data to a significant degree to make decisions, to allow data to tell stories, and to have that be a part of the overall structure of that agency. Now, lastly, this would be data driven. So this is kind of the end result, the last stage of this truly data driven culture. Data and data analysis, data collection, and all of its fun parts and glory plays a central role, fundamental and central role to decision-making processes, to all aspects of an agency or an organization. It is truly a part of every day of all parts of an agency. That's where this data-driven culture finally lands. So I did mention a poll. Daniel, I don't know if you can get that up or not. Cool, yeah, there it is. All right, so the question I have for all of you is, what stage of the data-driven culture is your agency in? So are you feeling like maybe as an agency as a whole, you're doing some things maybe not quite to the level as you'd like as data folks? Or is this something you guys are totally knocking out of the park, home run, no problem, absolutely data driven? So I'll give you guys some time to think about that and to give your answers. I know that there can be some overlap here. Data informed might be, the difference between data informed and data driven might be kind of slight. I can definitely say there's enough of my colleagues from ODFW that I don't want to spoil anything for them, or give my opinion and bias any of their responses. But there's absolutely an area where you're making decisions as an agency, and then there might be some areas where maybe it's not quite as heavily data driven as it could be. So yeah, I'll let that go for a couple seconds. And then we can continue. Oh, there we go. Sweet. All right. So it looks like, hey, nobody feels like their agency is in data denial or data indifference. That's a big thumbs up. Most people did say somewhere in the data informed area. So in that stage. And that's kind of what I expected. There's a lot of use. There's a lot of use of data, and we all see the value in data. And even as a state, as I don't want to, give too much of what we're going to talk about in a couple of slides, but there's a lot of structure in place already, in terms of how we want to proceed as a state when it comes to data, right? And so it makes sense that we at least have some of that going on. I would absolutely be curious when we open this up to a little more discussion, hear from some of the folks that were categorizing their agency as data aware, and data driven for that matter, right? Because we want to hear from you guys and see what challenges you guys have been having, or real success stories, real kind of like hit data out of the park sort of things. So thanks for participating there. Let's move on to more of the handout stuff. I'll hand that back to Hannah to talk more about that.
All right, thank you, Alan. So interested to see where everybody's organization falls on that range of becoming more data driven. It looks like there's some opportunities for improvement there. So how can we communicate the value of data and help advance our organizations across that range? And so what we have on this slide here is some of the first pieces in that handout. And again, you might have gotten that PDF via email, or you can access it through the chat. And the first point on that handout, and what you see here on the PowerPoint slide, is that data is for everyone. I'm wondering, have you ever started talking about data or measurement or maybe evaluation and just felt the room fill with tension, and maybe you notice people disengage? I will raise my hand for that. I've been there. I've come across people that think that, maybe data isn't for them, or that data doesn't have a place in their work. And I've found that I can cut the tension and increase engagement by just saying that data is for everyone. Data doesn't have to be intimidating, right, or super scientific. For example, the numbers you enter into a computer system, that's data, that's information, that's important. And again, I think that the people on the line here, I think that you know that. The point is here how to communicate that to others. We're going to be successful if we get that collaboration and we get that involvement and that engagement at all levels of the organization. And that success, that's part of the state's data strategic plan. That's the next point on this slide here and in that PDF handout. That's being that advocate for data, for the data-driven culture, for the data-driven decision-making. And what's on the next slide is again advancing along that PDF handout too, are specific talking points that you could use to advocate for data. And I'll just highlight a couple rather than talk through them all. So we have a couple on the screen here that I'll highlight, and again, more details and more information, more tips, more questions that you could ask the people you're working with in that PDF handout. The first point is about defining the goal and our purpose. And one way to put it is that our purpose or our goal is to collect relevant and accurate data, aka information, right? And understand what it means so that we can act on it, so that we can get those actionable insights. The data can help us understand performance. It can help us solve problems and make more confident and better decisions. Data can be used to identify trends, to help predict what could happen in the future, so that you can be more proactive about work and problems. And the last one that we have on there is a financial, because some people are very financially driven, is that data can save money. And again, more details and more questions you could ask in that PDF handout. Alan, is there anything that you'd add there that you'd like to highlight from the handout before moving on to the discussion?
Yeah, I would just kind of follow up on some of the things that you might encounter. So I think that the saving money thing is a real practical benefit here. There's a lot of examples where you might implement a system that can't actually be fully utilized in the way that you expect. And having some data collected beforehand, maybe users of this new modernization would really literally save you significant amounts of money. I think a lot about something my wife has been saying recently, which is buy nice or buy twice, right? So if you spend your money and you don't do your due diligence and collect your data and make sure you have a really, really, really good solid plan and understanding of what this is, what you're trying to accomplish, you go out and you spend some money on a fancy process, and it's not going to be the return you expect. So that's a real practical application of data saving you money in the long term. Yeah, so we can go on to the next part. Again, we're going to keep this kind of open. This part is going to be more of a discussion. We wanted to have this conversation with you all. There's definitely some good things that I know you guys can share from this. We had a couple talking points here. So in general, did you have any other talking points that you thought would be relevant to that list? Any other ways to show how important data is and to show people the value that data can bring, not necessarily just monetarily, but just the value in general. If there's success stories you wanted to share where you maybe changed somebody's mind about data, or pushed a project and pushed the data component of a project and it really paid off, or challenges that you may have been facing previously, facing currently, that you would want to talk to. Feel free to type it in chat. If you want to unmute, go for it. Those are all good. I think just to get the conversation started, I'll start. When I was in Alaska working on some of my dissertation work, it was on wildfire and kind of homeowner preferences for wildfire. Now, Department of Forestry up there, or Department of Natural Resources in Alaska, they had an idea of, okay, well, we need to inform homeowners based on risk, and it was very very kind of ecological, scientific from that perspective. And we were talking, through surveys and whatnot, we were asking some of these folks, and some of them didn't even have a great idea that where they were living was a high risk area. And so they're thinking of all the things they needed to do to their property, cleaning up leaf litter, all of this stuff was completely out of whack because they didn't even think that they were at risk. So there was like this fundamental flaw between the money that the Department of Natural Resources in Alaska is spending on getting people to engage in that sort of stuff. And actually having the people not even knowing what their risk levels were, what they were expected to be doing. So it was a great opportunity for us to share that work with them. It was a great opportunity to say, okay, we've done some data work, and that helped them understand their preferences better. It helped them understand their gaps in their education better. So I feel like that was a nice little success story. But I will now open this up to others.
So we did have a couple comments. One of them is on that sort of scale of data literacy, or the, I guess how agencies have adopted data. Somebody asked sort of whether there's really should be a number 6, which I think is, you utilize data, but you also utilize the data to answer the right type of questions. So they mentioned, things like, diversity, equity, justice, anti-racial policies, things like that, which seems like maybe it's a higher level that isn't necessarily covered by that scale.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that depending on how you want to look at stage 5, it could theoretically include it, but that's a very good point. I think that gets glossed over pretty often, where you can feel good maybe about applying, being really data driven and data focused in certain components of your agency, of feeling really on top of it. If you're an agency that deals with sales, if you're an agency that deals with any kind of monetary aspects or grants or whatever, it's really easy to kind of stay data driven on that things. They're literally numbers. They're coming at you. Are you collecting that? but making sure it's really kind of throughout the agency on every level that we're exactly like I said, we're asking the right questions. We're getting into the weeds. We're getting uncomfortable, right, with the levels of data that we need. We're asking tough questions. We're getting into it. I absolutely think that's an important and critical component to that true data literacy and data, like acknowledging data value in that way.
Hi, I'm Curtis Cood from Oregon Health Authority, and along those points, I had responded to something about data accuracy. You know, are the data good? And my question is really, are the data good enough? But before I really go there, I would just like to reflect on what do we mean by data? Data doesn't have to be, numbers, hard statistics. It can be information. It can be qualitative information. It can be stories that we're collecting. But those that counts as information that you need to make decisions too. Just taking a step back, I think it's really important as an organization that you decide what are your objectives, what are the decisions that you're trying to make, and then what is acceptable in terms of how biased those data are, or how precise they are. Is it, can you define what's good enough information for you to make the decisions that you need to make at that given point in time? So I'm just wondering if you wanted to respond to that in any way.
Yeah, I love that comment. So I was just having a conversation an hour ago on the value of qualitative responses and the value of that information, and how a lot of times it doesn't get its due. So absolutely, very much agree with that. I think that just having an understanding of data, being more than numbers and statistics, is very important and could absolutely keep an agency from that truly data-driven culture. And so the other point, I had a thought, and now I forgot. You think? Oh, okay. No. Do you mind repeating that last part? I thought I had it. I had something.
Yeah, it was, I started with, are the data good enough?
Yes.
And then, it's really about understanding what your objectives are for the decision that you need to make. What's the policy, what's the programmatic decision or strategy you're trying to develop. And then, you once you decide what your objectives are, then, you can set that boundary around is the data going to be good enough? What sort of bias in the data or precision, is acceptable to you?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that was it. So the data being good enough, I think. So in general, when I'm looking at things, I want precision, super accuracy. I want all of those things to be top notch, 100%. But I think it's a fallacy to think that all of our data is going to be perfect. I think just generally speaking, data is imperfect. I think generally speaking, we need to all be much more understanding of this fact, and that in the real world, it is sometimes virtually impossible to get data that truly accurately reflects what it is we are trying to measure. I think about IQ tests all the time, right? Well, the measure we're trying to actually or the thing we're trying to measure is intelligence. And the way we try to measure it and get data for it is this test. If there's a disconnect between those two, we have a problem. And that makes that data imperfect. And so I think just in general, we have an issue where we put data on this pedestal as being super precise and super accurate. And Daniel mentioned that my undergrad was in physics. I feel like that's one of the only places where they have that luxury, right, of like true measuring things and measuring it to that extent. The second you start, I mean, not that physics isn't the real world, but like the second you start dealing with other problems and social problems, and you're collecting data in different ways, you're coming up against it. You're coming up against it pretty quickly. And so that becomes all that more important, that much more important when you are making decisions, when you're identifying metrics, when you're getting an idea of what is acceptable. How are we measuring this? At what level of precision can we even attempt to get? And then at the end of the day, are we comfortable with making decisions based on the fact that this is imperfect? There's a difference between imperfect and not like good enough, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect to be incredibly useful, and it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be a great tool to make decisions on. And so it does require some pretty good reflection on what the requirements are, what you're trying to accomplish, and how imperfect that data can be, I suppose.
So Alan and Hannah, there's a comment from Phil, and I think it's it's a good one that sometimes you have support for making data-driven decisions at a project level. However, your organization as a whole, that maybe they're not as interested, and you need to sort of build that momentum. And that seems to be challenging. I've worked in organizations that have been like that, where you just struggle, you're going against the grain all the time. Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, suggestions might be a strong word, but I think that's a very cogent point. I think that identifying that change can often kind of start at different levels, and if there's not that structural support at the top, that it's pretty difficult. I will say though that at the end of the day, these are people and smart people that are running organizations, and that they can be that they can have those discussions and trying to show the value of different organizational shifts. I mean, in general, we like to, if we know something works, we want to stick with it, and so it might be difficult to get that change moving. But again, I mean, it might be a grassroots effort in that way. But ultimately, there's the good side of it, just being a person, right? They can be talked to and there can be a conversation, but they can also just kind of not like an idea and shut things down. And I don't know that there's much to do at that point. I will say though that again, Hannah mentioned the structure that's already in place for the state. So, we have a data best practices and a strategic plan for the data side. So I think that that's an easier sell now than it's ever been to start talking about things at an organizational level and say, this is how the statewide data organizational plan or strategic plan can be used organizationally here, specifically at whatever your agency is.
One thing I was thinking that I'll add, I mean, my recommendation is as much as possible, and I know that you oftentimes I think will struggle maybe working with some of your leadership and also the time that you have to invest, but try to be a leader yourself in the analysis that you conduct. So again, if you have the time and ability, if you can use the data that you have to you yourself ask meaningful questions and present those questions to your supervisors, and especially if they're questions that may potentially benefit them either in their career path or to better their programs. I've had a lot of success doing that, whereas I've been in organizations where instead of me making my own proposals, things kind of went the other way and I was handed assignments. And sometimes I just felt like you were going through motions and you weren't seeing sort of anything meaningful. So again, my recommendation is as best you can, try to take the wheel for the analysis that you create. I think that's where you'll be successful. And just so you guys know, I know we are at time. I'm going to give, we have a couple questions here, a couple comments. I'll go ahead and ask those, and we'll ask the speakers to stay and answer those. But I do want to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free, send, either send me a private message. You can also, email SORA at oregonresearch.org. And you know, some of the speakers here, Alan, Hannah, and Tasha, will get a copy of that email and they can respond to you directly. Again, thank you for your time. Just to answer a couple of these questions that have come up here. You know, one of the suggestions from one of the participants was, you know, to find a way to yes. You know, no is sort of the answer that we always hear. That's always sort of the first response you get. You know, however, there's typically a way to get to a yes answer. So being tenacious, you know, honing in on your skills, and I think to demonstrate your evidence as far as why data-driven decision making is important, is something that you can do, you know, to help get success for your organization. I know it's easier said than done, but you know, the person mentions, you know, don't quit at the first no, try to find your way to a yes. And I think that's actually, sorry, I said that we had comments. We had a comment. Again, thank you guys for your time. Again, this is our first in a series on data literacy. So we'll be holding our next event also on the topic, except we will move to a different one of those pillars of data literacy. Again, thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Again, any questions? Alan entered into the chat the email address. It's SORA@oregonresearch.org. Thank you guys, and have a nice evening.